I woke up holding a cup meant to end my life, and that was when I realized the world had already decided my role for me. In this palace of silk curtains and poisoned smiles, I was supposed to be the villain concubine who died before the third act. The problem was simple. I had no intention of following a script written by someone else. The poison burned sweet on my tongue, like fruit soaked in lies. And when nothing happened, the room fell into a silence so heavy it felt like judgment itself. That moment became the first crack in the fate that bound everyone here. Par the cup shook in my hand only because everyone around me expected it to. The attendant at my elbow held her breath like a prayer. The maid by the screen hid her face, as if watching my death would stain her sleeves. I understood the ritual instantly. The palace did not kill you with speed. It killed you with ceremony, with an audience that could later swear they saw you choose your own end. A villain dies conveniently, and the story moves on. The moment the poison failed, the audience froze, because the ritual had broken. For a heartbeat, I could hear the palace itself, silk rustling, incense humming, a distant bell waiting for the next line. I did not give it one. I set the cup down, wiped my mouth, and asked for water. Not panicked water, not pleading water, just water. Like I had decided I would live and the room had no vote. That was my first act of rebellion, treating survival as an assumption rather than a negotiation. I knew enough about court tales to recognize the trap. If I accused someone too early, I would be labeled hysterical and dangerous. If I forgave too quickly, I would be labeled soft and expendable. So I did something the palace rarely expects from women in silk. I measured. I watched who looked disappointed, who looked relieved, who looked eager to speak before the emperor arrived. I counted the seconds before someone offered condolences, and I noted whose condolences came with a suggestion: rest, isolation, silence. I began a private ledger, not of jewels or favors, but of moments: date, hour, location, who entered, who left, who handed me what, who insisted I swallow first. At first it felt absurd, like trying to trap smoke in a bottle. Then it started to work. Patterns love paper. The more I wrote, the more the palace's chaos revealed its rules. The first attempt after the cup was clumsy, as if the conspirators were testing whether fate still had my throat in its hands. A breakfast tray arrived with a porcelain spoon that smelled faintly of metal. The porridge was too glossy. The fruit was too bright. The maid's eyes were too fixed on my mouth. I ate none of it. I asked her to sit and share, smiling warmly, as if I were a generous concubine offering a treat. She went pale. Hunger in the palace is common. Sharing is not. When she stammered that servants could not, I nodded and said, "Then let us not waste it. Call the steward to record the tray and send it to the infirmary for disposal." The word record moved through the room like cold air. By noon, the steward who oversaw my meals had been replaced. No accusation, no scandal, just a quiet shift, like a chess piece removed without announcing the check. The second attempt was social, not chemical. A senior concubine sent me a gift, a silk sash embroidered with blessings, presented by two smiling girls who had been taught to look harmless. The sash smelled of bitter almond beneath the perfume. I held it up to the light and praised the needlework loudly enough for the corridor to hear. Then I requested the palace scribe. Not later, not tomorrow now. I asked him to note the donor, the date, the material, the seal on the box, and the scent. The girls' smiles tightened. They had expected gratitude. Gratitude turns into debt. A ledger turns into evidence. I wore the sash once to a public gathering, then placed it in a lacquered chest with a paper slip describing it in careful detail. If they wanted me dead by etiquette, I would answer them with bureaucracy. Soon I discovered the palace's favorite weapon was not poison but uncertainty. They moved things a handspan to the left and waited for me to doubt my own eyes. A cup that had been jade yesterday was suddenly porcelain. A servant who had sworn she never entered my room was spotted leaving through a side door. A rumor floated through the women's quarters that I had survived because I was using forbidden charms. Rumors are meant to isolate you. I did the opposite. I let the rumors grow, then I shaped them. If they were going to call me a monster, I would become the kind of monster that makes conspirators hesitate. I gave my attendants strict, boring routines. Food was sampled on schedule. Medicine was sealed with wax. Gifts were opened in front of witnesses. I made survival procedural, because procedure turns fear into a checklist. My allies were not born from devotion. They were born from fatigue. A kitchen servant had watched too many trays leave for funerals. A junior guard was tired of watching bribes buy midnight silence. A scribe with ink-stained fingers wanted to be something other than a liar for hire. A physician, brilliant and bitter, hated how his skill had been reduced to a costume for other people's cruelty. I did not promise them riches. I promised them cover-written orders, documented tasks, plausible reasons to be where they needed to be. The palace punishes rebellion, but it tolerates paperwork. Paperwork is a disguise that even power respects. We created an internal map. Which doors lacked guards at dawn, which courtyards were watched by loyal eyes, which storerooms held seals and stamps. The more we mapped, the smaller the palace felt. Walls are less frightening when you know where they end. Par. From that day on, every assassination attempt became a lesson. Every whispered conspiracy a data set. The emperor, who should have been a tyrant carved from cruelty, revealed himself to be another outsider trapped in a role he never chose. Together, we dismantled the palace, not with swords, but with records, patterns, and the quiet terror of truth. Rumors twisted, alliances shifted, and the legends about me grew more absurd with each failed plot, until fear itself became my shield. What none of them understood was that survival was never my final goal. Freedom was. Par. The emperor noticed the change long before he acknowledged it. At banquets, he watched my hands more than my face. He watched how I never reached first, how I let others touch the food before I did. He watched how I spoke to courtiers politely, precisely, never giving them a sentence they could twist into treason. When he finally summoned me, I expected interrogation. Instead, he asked one question, quiet enough that only I could hear. Who told you to die? That question was not curiosity. It was recognition. Only someone who had been scripted understands what it means to be assigned an ending. In the candlelight, his reputation felt like another layer of costume. Tyrant, beast, cruel ruler. But his eyes were not the eyes of a man who enjoys blood. They were the eyes of a man who has learned that enjoying nothing is safer. Par. He did not offer romance. He offered structure. If you want to live, he said, stop fighting shadows. Bring me patterns. He gave me a narrow key to the archives and the authority to request accounting records under the pretense of reviewing tribute. In return, I gave him my ledger of attempts, my notes on who flinched when I spoke of records, my observations about which servants seemed newly assigned. We formed a pact without touching hands. It was not tender, but it was steady, and steadiness is rarer than affection in a place built on sudden reversals. That night, I walked back through the corridor with a new sensation in my chest. Not safety, exactly, but an exit route. For the first time, the palace felt like a system I could inspect, rather than a fate I had to endure. Par. The archives smelled of dust and old ink, the scent of truths that had been locked away until their owners died. I worked by lamplight, rolling scrolls open with careful fingers, and I began to see how power moved when nobody was watching. A concubine's stipend reduced the month after she argued with a minister's wife. A guard unit reassigned 2 days before a prince's riding accident. A physician transferred after diagnosing poison where the court wanted illness. The palace wrote its crimes down, not as confessions, but as administrative changes. Patterns gathered like storm clouds. I marked names, seals, and dates, then cross-referenced them with my own ledger. The overlaps were not random. They belonged to a faction with clean robes and dirty hands. A ring of officials and inner court figures who believed the throne was theirs to steer by killing anyone inconvenient. Par. The conspirators tried to adapt. When poison failed, they tried pressure. An older matron approached my attendants with threats disguised as advice. "Serve her well," she murmured, "or you will be blamed when she falls. Fear is a leash that works on servants faster than it works on nobles." I countered with protection. I asked the emperor to issue a small, almost laughable edict. Any servant assigned to my quarters would be paid directly from a separate account, and any reassignment would require written cause and 2 seals. The court mocked the pettiness of it. They did not understand that pettiness is the language of control. By turning control into paperwork, we made sabotage expensive. The matron could still whisper, but now every movement left fingerprints. Par-rumor warfare became my shield. If they said I was cursed, I let the curse sound practical. If they said I could detect poison, I let the story include details that made people nervous. That my tongue went numb when a cup was tainted. That my pulse slowed near certain incense. That I could smell bitter almond through lacquer. The details did not have to be true. They had to be believable enough to make someone hesitate. when a young concubine tried to provoke me publicly, calling me arrogant and dangerous. I answered with a soft smile and asked her to repeat her accusation in front of the palace recorder. She laughed too loudly and refused. The crowd noticed. A refusal becomes a confession when you demand clarity. Soon, people stopped cornering me with jokes. Jokes are safe only when the target is obligated to blush. Par. One night, a dagger slid beneath my door with a note tied to its hilt. A threat written in elegant handwriting. In my first life, I would have hidden it, ashamed of being targeted. In this life, I carried it to the Emperor at dawn. I did not bring it as a plea. I brought it as an artifact. He examined the blade, then the knot, then the paper's fibers. He asked the head eunuch which storeroom issued that kind of steel. By noon, the storeroom clerk was sweating under questions that sounded polite and felt like iron. The palace is used to threats being private. When you make them public, you force the aggressor to either escalate or retreat. Escalation creates more evidence. Retreat creates fear. Both outcomes serve you, if you are patient. Par. The emperor was careful with his own image, because in the palace, image is armor. He could not openly protect me without feeding the story that I had bewitched him. So he protected me through systems, audits, rotations, stamp controls, and a new habit of asking for signatures. A minister who had once spoken boldly began to stutter when asked to confirm his instructions in writing. A consort who had once laughed at my survival began to avoid eye contact, suddenly preoccupied with her sleeves. I watched the court learn a new kind of fear. Not fear of punishment, but fear of exposure. Exposure is worse than punishment for people who build their power on ambiguity. Par. The breaking point came when they moved too fast. A ledger entry was altered to hide a payment, but the ink was fresh and the hand unfamiliar. A guard rotation was changed without proper seals, creating a gap in the night patrol. A physician was ordered to declare an illness in a woman who had bitten her own lip to keep from screaming. These were small mistakes, the kind conspirators make when they believe the next move will be the last. We collected the mistakes and arranged them like tiles. Each tile alone could be explained. Together they formed an image the court could not deny. Par. On the day of the hearing, the emperor held court with an expression as calm as still water. Courtiers lined the hall like lacquered statues, each one calculating whether to bow deeper or speak first. I stood behind a screen, not because I was ashamed, but because the palace demanded I be unseen. I let it think it still controlled the stage. The emperor began with money tribute accounts, stipend disbursements, procurement orders. Then he moved to seals, whose stamp appeared where it should not, whose handwriting matched the altered entry. Finally, he moved to witnesses. The scribe stepped forward with trembling hands and read aloud what he had recorded weeks earlier. Dates, names, orders. Truth in the palace is not a shout. It is a list. When the list becomes long enough, even the proudest liar runs out of air. Par. Some people begged, some denied. Some tried to blame servants, as if power never touches dirt. The emperor did not raise his voice. He simply asked for the next document. That was the cruelty the court feared most. Not a tyrant's rage, but a ruler's refusal to be distracted. When a senior official attempted to turn the matter into a moral scandal suggesting I had manipulated the emperor, I emerged from behind the screen and bowed. Then I asked, clearly, whether he was accusing His Majesty of being controlled, and if so, whether he wished to submit that accusation in writing. Silence crashed through the hall. In one sentence, I forced him to choose between his insult and his survival. He swallowed his words. The emperor's eyes met mine briefly. In that glance, we were not allies out of affection. We were allies out of shared refusal. Par. Afterward, the palace did not become kind. It became cautious. Caution is not justice, but it creates space. The faction's leaders were removed quietly. Some exiled, some imprisoned, some falling ill, the way inconvenient people often do. The women's quarters remained a garden with thorns, but now the thorns had names, and naming is power. Servants began to speak to me with something like relief, because the rules had started to apply imperfectly, unevenly, but more than before. I continued to keep my ledger, not because I expected betrayal every hour, but because I had learned how quickly safety can be rewritten by someone with a seal. Par. In the evenings, the emperor and I spoke in the language we trusted, logistics. He asked what I wanted in return. The court expected jewels, titles, a crown, a future chain to the throne. I asked for one document, a decree granting me the right to leave the palace freely, unpursued, unclaimed, unpunished. His brows lifted. For a moment, he looked younger, as if the question had surprised a part of him that still believed possession was the only form of protection. Then he nodded slowly, understanding what I was really asking. Not permission to travel, but permission to be a person outside a narrative. In agreeing, he was also carving a door for himself, a reminder that rule does not have to mean captivity. Preparing to leave was not dramatic. It was careful. I stored copies of my records in 3 places. I paid my allies quietly, and ensured their reassignment came with plausible reasons. I wrote letters that would be delivered only if I vanished, letters addressed to offices outside the inner court. The palace thrives on removing options. I rebuilt options like someone repairing a bridge plank by plank. A few women watched me pack with eyes full of questions. Some envied me, some feared me. Some simply did not understand why anyone would abandon silk for uncertainty. They did not know that silk can be a rope if it is tied by someone else. On my final morning, I walked through the corridors where my death had been rehearsed. The screen where the attendant hid her face, the alcove where incense pooled like fog, the courtyard where rumors had once gathered like birds waiting to peck. I touched the curtain and felt its softness, then remembered how soft things can suffocate. I bowed to the emperor not as a lover, not as a servant, but as a collaborator who had finished her part of the work. He did not ask me to stay. That was the last gift he gave me. Not a chain disguised as affection. When the palace gates opened, the air outside smelled like dust and sunlight instead of perfume and fear. I stepped through without looking back, because I had spent too many lives looking back. Freedom did not arrive with applause. It arrived with ordinary decisions. Where to live, what to eat, who to trust, what to do with my hands when no one was watching. I found work with merchants who valued my ability to keep ledgers clean, and with magistrates who needed petitions translated into clear, recorded claims. I built a life the way I once built survival through systems. I kept receipts. I kept copies. I asked for promises in writing. When people tried to test me with soft manipulation, I recognized the pattern and stepped away. The palace had taught me that stories are cages. Outside its walls, I learned the quieter truth. A life can be built without needing an audience to validate it. When the last secret surfaced and the final conspiracy collapsed under its own weight, I did not claim victory. I walked away from the throne, from the titles, from the endless cycle of poison and power. The palace remained behind me, still beautiful, still rotten, but no longer my cage. In choosing to live, I had rewritten everything. The palace had a language for everything, and I forced myself to learn it like a cipher. When a eunuch said, "It is inconvenient," he meant, "Someone powerful dislikes this." When a consort said, "I worry for your health," she meant, "I want you to doubt your strength." When a minister said, "For the stability of the Inhals-9 realm," he meant, "For the stability of my faction." Once I began translating their speech into intent, the court became less mystical and more mechanical. Machines can be studied. Machines can be jammed. I stopped arguing with people who pretended not to understand. I began asking questions, whose answers required commitment. Which department? Which signature? Which witness? Which deadline? Even the most elegant liar hates deadlines, because a deadline forces the lie to take a specific shape. There were days I failed to be perfect. A new maid spilled tea near my sleeve, and my body reacted before my mind did. I flinched as if the cup were a weapon. The room noticed. In the palace, noticing becomes gossip within an hour. I did not punish myself for flinching. I treated it as information. I adjusted routines. I reduced my exposure to crowded tea services. I insisted on sealed pots. I asked my guard ally to stand closer during public events. People assume strength means never being afraid. In reality, strength is building procedures that keep you moving, even when fear remains. The emperor's tyrant reputation was a shield we both used. When he enacted an audit, courtiers assumed it was cruelty and hurried to comply. They did not imagine it was fairness wearing a frightening mask. When he refused a minister's request, the court assumed it was caprice. They did not imagine it was strategy. This was the most bitter lesson of the palace. Sometimes the only way to do good inside a rotten system is to borrow the system's ugliness as camouflage. I did not romanticize it. I understood it. And understanding is how you avoid being swallowed. At one banquet, the faction attempted a spectacle. A dancer was instructed to trip near my table, spilling wine across my lap to provoke laughter and humiliation. Humiliation is a soft assassination. It kills your credibility so future accusations sound like drama. I saw the dancer's eyes wide, pleading, terrified. When she fell, I stood, caught her elbow, and steadied her. I spoke loudly enough for the room to hear. Careful, the floor is slick. Someone should check whether oil was spilled. The laughter died. The emperor gestured to the guards. Suddenly, the spectacle became an investigation. The dancer wept with relief, and the faction learned that even their entertainment could be turned into a ledger entry. I learned to protect the people beneath me because protecting them protected me. A servant who believes you will sacrifice her will sell you out to the first person who offers safety. A servant who believes you will shield her will warn you when danger approaches. I made my quarters a place where rules were clear. No private meetings, no secret gifts, no sudden errands at night. I taught my attendants to answer bribes with a phrase that sounded respectful and was actually a wall. Please submit the request in writing. We practiced it until it became reflex. Reflexes save lives in a palace. When I finally understood who had commissioned my death, the answer was not a single jealous woman but a network. Networks are harder to kill with a sword, but easier to kill with exposure. The faction needed the emperor unpredictable, so they could guide him. They needed concubines disposable, so alliances could be arranged without resistance. They needed the court's memory short so crimes could be recycled as new scandals. My survival threatened all three needs. That is why the attempts kept coming, not because they hated me personally, but because my continued breathing made their system look breakable. I did not become gentle by surviving. I became precise. Precision is how you keep empathy from becoming a weakness others can exploit. When an ally panicked, I did not scold. I gave them a plan. When a rumor turned sharp, I did not chase it. I redirected it with facts that could be verified. When the palace demanded I show emotion as proof of innocence, I refused. Innocence should not require performance. In refusing to perform, I took back the authority to define myself. Even my so-called villainy became a tool. I used the role they assigned me, the way you use a mask in smoke, to breathe without being recognized. If they expected me to be selfish, I could act without begging for approval. If they expected me to be ruthless, I could enforce boundaries without appearing unfeminine. The story had meant to trap me. I used it as camouflage, then slipped out through the gap it created. By the time the final conspiracy collapsed, the court had already started rewriting history. They claimed the emperor had discovered the plots alone. They claimed the purges were inevitable. They claimed I had always been protected. I let them rewrite the story, because the story was never my destination. My destination was the gate. I left with my name intact, my body alive, and my mind no longer chained to other people's narratives. That was enough. I rented a small room above a tea shop where the floorboards creaked honestly, not like the palace floors that creaked to warn someone else. The landlord only cared that I paid on time. I found that simplicity almost shocking. In the palace, every transaction was a disguised favor. Outside, coin could simply be coin. I spent my first month learning ordinary life. How to bargain without bowing. How to walk a street without calculating sightlines. How to sleep without listening for silk footsteps outside my door. News from the capital reached me through merchants and travelers. Each time I heard that a former conspirator had been promoted elsewhere, or that an audit had quietly changed the flow of bribes, I realized the emperor had kept his side of our pact. He was reforming the court the only way it would tolerate, by changing the plumbing instead of the facade. People praised him for strength. I knew the truth was less glamorous and more difficult. He was practicing restraint where the palace expected spectacle. Once, a messenger arrived with an invitation sealed in imperial wax. My heart did not leap. It tightened. Invitations from power are rarely gifts. I opened it carefully and found only a short sentence. The decree promised, written clearly, that no one could compel my return. He had signed it with a steady hand. I folded the paper and felt something in me loosen, as if a knot I had carried for years finally accepted it could be untied. I met women who had survived different versions of the same cage. Wives bought with dowries, daughters traded for alliances, servants blamed for masters' sins. They told their stories in fragments, the way people speak when they have learned that full truth is dangerous. I did not ask them to dramatize their pain. I offered them tools, how to keep copies, how to write timelines, how to request records from an office that pretended it had none. Small tools, but small tools can pry open locked doors. Par. The city had its own conspiracies, but they were simpler. A shopkeeper cheated on weights. A clerk demanded a fee for a stamp. A landlord tried to raise rent mid-month. None of it carried the perfume of destiny. I handled these disputes with the same calm I had learned in court. Ask for the rule, ask for the paper, ask for the name. Most bullies retreat when you refuse to meet them in fog. In the palace, fog was tradition. Outside, fog was just an excuse. Par. Sometimes I dreamed of the cup again, the sweet burn, the frozen faces. In the dream, I always did the same thing. I set the cup down and asked for water. When I woke, I understood that the dream was not warning me of danger anymore. It was reminding me of my own decision. Fate had tried to write my ending as sacrifice. I had answered with a request so ordinary it became revolutionary. Let me live. Par. One spring, I visited a temple on a hill and watched pilgrims tie red ribbons to a tree, each ribbon carrying a wish. In the palace, wishes were currency and prayers were politics. Here, people wished for rain, for children, for a healed leg. I did not tie a ribbon. I simply stood in the wind and felt gratitude without needing to disguise it as strategy. Freedom, I realized, is when even your gratitude belongs to you. Par. A traveling scholar recognized me by accident, not from portrait scrolls, but from rumor. He asked if the stories were true. Did I really drink poison and smile? Did I really ruin a faction with nothing but ledgers? I told him the stories were exaggerated. He seemed disappointed. So I added the part that mattered. I survived because I learned to treat truth as a craft. He wrote that down, and I hoped that sentence, at least, would travel honestly. Par. I kept my ledger even after I no longer needed it for survival. The habit had become a form of self-respect. I wrote down expenses, lessons learned, conversations that mattered. Over time, the pages stopped being about threats and started being about plans. A business idea, a new skill, a place I wanted to see. The same tool that had once recorded danger began recording possibility. That shift felt like healing. Par. When I passed a mirror in a market stall, I barely recognized the woman looking back. In the palace, my face had been a symbol villain, temptation, target. Here, my face was simply mine. I bought a hairpin that was not dipped in anything. I laughed at that, quietly, and the vendor laughed too without knowing why. It was the first time I had shared laughter that carried no trap. Par. I never returned to the inner court, but I did not pretend it had been meaningless. The palace had taught me to see systems, and seeing systems is a power you can carry anywhere. I used it to choose employers who documented expectations, to avoid contracts with hidden clauses, to build friendships with people whose kindness did not require my silence. In doing so, I proved that the palace had failed at its deepest goal. It had not made me smaller. Par. Years later, when someone tried to tell me that my life must have been guided by destiny, I shook my head. Destiny is what people call your story when they want to avoid admitting that someone hurt you on purpose. I knew the names of the people who had tried to kill me. I knew the handwriting, the seals, the routes of the couriers. I had survived not because the heavens favored me, but because I refused to cooperate with their plan. Refusal, repeated, becomes a new fate. Par. There was one last test of the old world. A noble family attempted to hire me as a private clerk, lured by the myth that I could sniff out betrayal. Their offer was generous and their tone falsely humble. I declined. I did not want to become a tool inside another house of silk. I wanted a life where my skills served my freedom, not someone else's control. Par. I wrote a short handbook for myself: how to respond when someone threatens, how to recognize coercion disguised as kindness, how to ask for time before agreeing to anything. It was not poetry. It was maintenance. Some people keep charms. I kept procedures. Par. When I heard that a new concubine had arrived at court, young and terrified, I felt the old anger rise not at her, but at the machinery that would try to grind her down. I sent money anonymously to a relative who could support her if she escaped. I could not rescue everyone, but I could move one small lever in the direction of mercy. Par. Freedom also meant learning what I liked when no one was watching. I discovered I preferred plain tea to perfumed blends, that I enjoyed walking at dawn, that I hated rooms with only one door. These preferences felt trivial until I realized they were mine, chosen without fear. Par. People sometimes assume that escaping a plot means you must also defeat every villain who helped write it. They expect revenge to be loud. Mine was never loud. Mine was systematic. I did not hunt every petty enemy. I dismantled the conditions that made petty enemies effective. Inside the palace, that meant sealing jars, counting seals, demanding signatures. Outside the palace, it meant building income, building references, building a life no rumor could easily break. When you have been targeted by stories, the most devastating response is to become boringly, provably real. I remembered the servants who had disappeared after doing what they were told, and I refused to repeat that cycle with the people who helped me. Before I left, I arranged small exits for them. A transfer with a legitimate reason, a recommendation letter stamped by an office that mattered, a modest sum paid through a merchant who asked no questions. I did not call it charity. I called it debt paid properly. The palace survives by making everyone complicit. I tried, in my small sphere, to make fewer people complicit. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered what would have happened if the poison had worked. Would the court have sighed with relief and moved on to the next scandal? Would my death have become a footnote in someone else's romance? The thought hardened me, not into cruelty, but into clarity. A life that can be erased so easily must be defended fiercely. That is the real meaning of villainy in a place like that. Not being evil, but refusing to be disposable. The emperor never wrote to me often. But when he did, his words were sparse and practical. A note about a new audit policy. A note about a minister removed from office. A note about an edict requiring double seals for inter-court transfers. Each note was a reminder that the palace had not swallowed him either. People in the city treated him like a legend. I knew he was a man fighting paperwork demons, and I respected him for it. I eventually learned to smile without calculating whether the smile would be used against me. At first, my expressions were tools. Later, they became human again. I made friends who did not ask for my story as entertainment. When they asked, it was to understand how to help. In that difference, curiosity versus care, I found a kind of peace I had never believed was possible inside lacquered walls. There were festivals where lanterns floated above the river like bright thoughts released into the night. I watched families laugh, children run, couples quarrel, and reconcile without fear of eavesdropping. The scene felt almost unreal. In the palace, light meant visibility, and visibility meant danger. Here, light was simply celebration. I stood on the riverbank and let myself be anonymous. Anonymity, I realized, can be a form of safety too. Once, a local official tried to intimidate me, assuming a woman alone would fold. He spoke of fines and inspections and hinted that my paperwork was incomplete. I listened, then asked him to show me the regulation he was citing. He could not. I asked him to put his demand in writing. His confidence leaked out of him like air from a punctured skin. The palace had taught me the oldest trick. Bullies thrive on unwritten rules. I kept a small box with 3 items: a copy of the emperor's decree, a blank ledger, and a plain wooden hairpin. The decree reminded me that freedom can be granted on paper, but must be maintained in practice. The ledger reminded me that truth requires upkeep. The hairpin reminded me that not every object is a weapon. Some are just objects. On difficult days, the hairpin was the strangest comfort, proof that my instincts could rest. If anyone asked whether I had changed the palace, I answered honestly. I changed a corner of it, and that corner was enough to let me leave alive. Systems are too large to purify overnight, but a single door can be opened, and when one door opens, other people notice. Maybe another concubine asked for records instead of forgiveness. Maybe another servant demanded a seal before running an errand. Small changes spread the way rumors spread quietly, quickly, without permission. Freedom also meant accepting that I would never be able to explain myself to everyone. Some people preferred the legend because legends are easier than nuance. They wanted me to be a sorceress, or a seductress, or a saint. I refused all 3. I was a woman who learned to survive by turning the palace's own tools against it. That is not romance. That is craft. On certain mornings, I woke and forgot, for a brief moment, that I had ever been hunted. The forgetfulness startled me, then made me laugh. Healing, I discovered, is sometimes as simple as that. A moment when your body stops rehearsing danger. When the memory returned, it returned softer, like an old scar touched by accident rather than a fresh wound. I never again drank from a cup offered with too much ceremony, but I did drink tea with friends, in humble cups chipped at the rim, and I learned to enjoy it. The difference was not the cup. The difference was consent. In the palace, every sip was a test. Outside, a sip could simply be a sip. That small, ordinary pleasure felt like the truest victory. I started writing my own story in the simplest way. I kept a journal that was not evidence, not strategy, not a weapon, just memory. I wrote about weather, about markets, about the taste of noodles at a street stall. At first it felt frivolous, almost irresponsible, like putting down a sword. Then I realized that choosing frivolity is a kind of proof. You cannot enjoy small things if you still belong to the cage. When strangers praised the emperor's reforms, I did not claim credit. I had no desire to be pulled back into a narrative of power. But privately, I felt a quiet satisfaction every time I heard that audits had become routine, that bribe routes had been disrupted, that inner court transfers required more scrutiny. It meant the palace was learning a new habit: accountability. Some nights I sat by my window and watched patrol lanterns pass along the street. Not imperial guards, just ordinary night watch. The sound of their steps did not tighten my throat. I realized then that my body had been trained to react to authority as if authority were always danger. Relearning calm was slow, but it was possible, and that possibility was the gift I had fought for. If I could speak to the girl who lifted the poisoned cup, I would not tell her to be brave. Bravery is a word that flatters suffering. I would tell her to be specific. Ask who, ask when, ask for the seal, ask for the witness. Specificity is how you take a story that wants to swallow you and turn it into a case you can win. In the end, the palace's greatest mistake was assuming that my survival would make me grateful enough to accept any chain. They offered me comfort inside captivity. I chose uncertainty outside it. That choice puzzled them, because power cannot imagine being refused. But refusal is exactly what breaks a script. People who have never lived inside a trap assume the trap is obvious. They think you can simply refuse and walk away. But the palace was built to make refusal feel impossible. It offered comfort laced with obligation and punishment laced with, for your own good. The script that named me villain was one more layer of the trap. If I resisted, they could call it proof of my wickedness. I learned to resist anyway, but with a discipline that gave them nothing theatrical to point at. I refused like a clerk stamping a paper, calmly, repeatedly, until the refusal became normal. I also learned that assassination does not always look like a blade. Sometimes it looks like a missing letter, a delayed stipend, a closed door at the wrong hour. The palace tried to kill me by reducing my options. Each time an option disappeared, I created two more, even if they were small. An ally in the kitchen, a witness in the corridor, a copy of a note stored outside my rooms. Over time, the palace's effort to narrow my life only taught me how to widen it. If I had stayed, I might have become powerful in the way the court admires owning other people's futures, trading favors like coins, smiling while deciding who suffers. I saw that path and stepped away. My goal was never to replace one cage with a larger cage. My goal was to reclaim the right to choose what my days contained. In that sense, leaving was the most radical act I committed, because it denied the palace its favorite lie, that power is the same thing as freedom. On the road after I left, I watched the capital shrink behind me until the palace roofs became a thin line, and then nothing at all. I expected triumph. What I felt instead was exhaustion, the deep kind that comes after years of listening for footsteps. I let myself be exhausted. I slept in inns where nobody bowed. I ate food that did not require a taster. Each ordinary comfort felt like an antidote slowly working through my blood. Later, when people asked me how I survived, I did not tell them to become fearless. Fear kept me alive. I told them to become organized. Organization is how you make fear useful.